If you want, it's Emily Fox. Today's video is going to be my top 5 best fantasy series I have read since my time on Booktube. It was really hard because I only wanted to include series that I have finished, which, if you don't know anything about this channel, I cannot finish a series to save my life. It's going to be one of my challenges next year, so it will change. I will be able to do an update video or just share more favorites. I have done quite a few videos like this about sci-fi, so it's time for me to do the same thing with fantasy, so bear with me, but it was not easy, but we made it. These are the ones that I recommend the most. Would this really be a best fantasy video without including some Sanderson? Absolutely not. So I wanted to mention the first Mistborn trilogy by Sanderson. I really enjoyed it. It was the first series that I've read by him. It's not necessarily the best way, in my opinion, to start. I did do a whole video reviewing all the books that I've read by him, mentioning which ones I would recommend starting with. It's not the worst way to start, but it's a whole trilogy. It's like all 3 pretty big books, and I do think that like in the second book, there are times that it's a little slow. But I love the world building and the magic system. First time trying him, you're going to be impressed. In this case, you have the people that can use magical powers have to consume metals and burn them, and they can only be used in a very, very strict way. So some people can push on metals, people can pull on them. And the series contains one of my all-time favorite characters. I tend to love really like wholesome ones, and there is Sazed, I think you're supposed to call him. I pronounce it Sazed. I pronounce everything kind of French in my head. But I love him. He's great. I love him. There's also the fact that there's not a ton of romance. I tend to just dislike whenever a book is labeled as fantasy and turns out it's mostly a romance in a fantasy world. Not the case. Whenever there is a love interest, which there's definitely like a romance-ish in this series, it doesn't overpower the story, and there's nothing explicit. So there's not like half the book there's like sex scenes or anything. So Sanderson doesn't include really anything like that. His endings are always really shocking. We will all have to agree with this. But I really enjoyed seeing in the last book specifically all the pieces fall into place and everything made sense. You know, he planned everything. And even the things that maybe I wasn't super crazy about, it all made sense. And I really enjoyed seeing what he did with his ideas. And the main complaint that I hear about this series is the characters not being extremely well developed, which I do think he has improved in his other series, but it's not completed. I'm not done with all the books that are out either, so I couldn't include that in the book. So I couldn't include this in the video, but I highly recommend this series. It's really fantastic. I adore it. Eventually, I might reread them. But so far, the Mistborn world, the first trilogy is still by far my favorite. Oh, and quickly, the first book is basically like a heist. So always a good thing in fantasy. Next I needed to talk about is Dark Materials trilogy. I have this gorgeous like edition, all 3 books in one. I read these books as a kid in French and I cried. I literally remember like finishing the last book and crying, which I did reread them a few years ago on Booktube, and I didn't cry that time, but it still broke my heart. And I feel like what was fascinating was noticing that first off, it does still stand as an adult. I thought it was a children's book as a kid, but no, these are definitely for adults too. And I realized how much went way past my head as a kid. So I highly recommend rereading these if you read them as a kid. It's still fantastic. The world building, the fact that people have like demons, which is like half their soul, the fact that the world building is really interesting. Things get more and more intense throughout the whole trilogy. When it came out, there was a little bit of controversy, and by a little bit, I mean quite a bit, because essentially the message tends to be against organized religions, and obviously that didn't really go well with a lot of religions, but I really enjoyed it. I do think it's a lot of fun, and I would highly recommend it. I feel like everyone has heard of that one, so I don't want to go too much in details, but there's a TV show, which I'm curious to watch the 2nd season. So far, it's been better than the movie, which the bar was low. Oh, and story-wise, the first book starts with a bunch of kids are being kidnapped. You don't know why, and then Lyra, the main character, decides that she wants to investigate. Next, I needed to talk about the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, the first book being the 5th season, and I haven't read anything quite like this. It's a little bit confusing. Do be prepared to like go through like the first half to get used to the writing style first off, because some of the narration is told in the second person, so it can be a little confusing. You have no idea what's going on, and there's also a few different timelines, so it's like very confusing at first, but totally worth it. It's fantasy, but a little sci-fi too, kind of apocalyptic world building. It seems like the end of the world is approaching, you don't know why. And one narration that you're following is this woman who seems to be living a normal life. She's married in a small village with 2 children, but one day her husband kills their son and then kidnaps their daughter, and she's trying to obviously get her back. And there's magic, obviously. It's a little complicated to explain, and there's also really, really great characters. I loved some of them. There's also LGBTQ plus representation, and the story becomes more and more complicated. Frankly, even if I wanted to spoil it and explain it to you, I would struggle. So just if you want something creative and unique, you need to try this book, this series, really. I recently finished the Puppy War Trilogy, and so worth it. So worth it. Highly recommend this also. I particularly enjoyed the fact that it starts pretty small, and every book the story and the world becomes bigger and bigger. So you're following Rin, who is a morally gray character. Very morally gray. And she's trying to get out of her small village and wants to go to this military school to become like an officer in the military. And she at first studies to get there, and then it gets again bigger and bigger. It turns out that magic is a thing, and it's related to gods who, the few people that can use their magical powers, it's connected to gods. And the gods are not good, so the more power you use, the crazier you become until, you know, you completely lose it. And think of every single trigger warning you can think of. It's probably in there. Would definitely recommend checking those out, because it is inspired by war, and like, I think it was the China's 20th century wars, and a lot of stuff happens. So it's like historical military fantasy, and I just really, really enjoyed it. I have to say that the last book ended well for me. Like, I wasn't happy with the ending, but I think it was the right ending. I feel like, I don't know about you, but I find myself always disappointed by the last book in a trilogy, which even if I overall enjoyed the series, I feel like if you don't love the ending of the last book, it kind of just ruins the whole thing. And in this case, I wasn't prepared for it, but I think it was the right thing to do. So if you want to read a really fantastic military fantasy, I would highly recommend Puppy War. I feel like it's been going around quite a bit, but it's still worth it. I recommend it. The other day I was doing a video, I was reading 1-star reviews of books that I loved, and I did it with this book. I was also drinking. I would recommend at your own risk to watch this. But the only complaint that really people had was that this is a book about children who use magical abilities to defeat entire armies in completely silly ways. That's kind of what fantasy books are. So if that's your thing. And last but not least, okay, it was not easy to choose the last one for a top 5, but I had to be honest with myself and all of you and admit that the Winners Trilogy, I just had so much fun reading it. And it's something that you're either going to love or absolutely hate. I binge read the crap out of this, and I was not expecting this. I never thought. But this is a YA fantasy romance series, and it just worked for me. Be prepared. If you usually like my usual stuff, read this at your own risk. I have barely anything else to compare it to because I don't usually read romance because I often hate them, but for some reason this one worked for me. It is what it is. You're following the daughter of a general, and then there's like this romance with just saying that out loud, I'm blushing, like a slave who turns out to be someone important from the enemy, blah blah blah. It worked. I read it so fast. I am so scared to reread this because what if I hate it the second time around? But between the 3 books, if I have to choose a favorite, it's going to be book number 2. I mean, if there's a romance, that's where there's the most, you know, struggle. And yeah, I read it so fast. I feel like I haven't binge read a series like this in forever, so maybe I should try it again. And as I was saying in the beginning of the video, I'm currently in the middle of like probably like 20 fantasy series, not joking. So I think that whenever I finish a couple more next year, I'll be able to give you more recommendations. But as of now, I think, unless I'm forgetting something, I'm pretty sure this is my official top 5 that I've read so far, that I've finished so far. I would love to hear your thoughts on these, telling me I have horrible or amazing taste. We can always debate this politely in the comment section. Let me know your favorite ones, any of the ones that I should be reading next, because I'm definitely open to be in the middle of more series, because why not? Thumbs up, subscribe. I will be putting more videos on the screen that I recommend you check out, and I will see you in an upcoming video very soon. Bye. Only you're the reason why I can feel those butterflies.